Jamie with Country Diggers here. Today we're going to do a little history on Margaret, Princess Margaret, Queen Elizabeth II's younger sister. Now, she's the princess who caused a bank robbery. Okay, she's pretty cool. And we're going to do a history on her. And then the next video you see, I will be on the beach. So stay tuned. All right. Okay. Today is More Princesses Behaving Badly by Linda Rodriguez McRobbie. And today we're talking about Princess Margaret, Queen Elizabeth's younger sister. Okay. The princess who caused a bank robbery. She was born August 21st, 1930, and died February 9th, 2002 in Great Britain. The heist made headlines, and rightfully so. On the night of Saturday, September 11th, 1971, a gang of thieves tunneled into the safety deposit box vault at Lloyd's Bank and made off with an untold fortune. The perpetrators had rented a storefront 2 doors down at the corner of Baker Street and Marylebone Road. Under the cover of renovations, they dug a tunnel about 40 feet long, passing under a Chicken Inn restaurant and emerging inside the vault. At the crime scene were the scrawled words, "Let Sherlock Holmes try to solve this." Estimates at the time put the haul at around £500,000, but in fact it was much more, perhaps as much as £3 million, $51 million today. It's impossible to know the full value of the contents of the safety deposit boxes. In the end, it didn't take the legendary detective to figure out who did it. In 1973, 4 men were arrested and jailed for the crime, although the mastermind was never apprehended. But just 4 days after this incredible story broke, the newspaper stopped talking about it. In the world of British tabloids, that was extraordinary. Rumors spread that the authorities had put out a D notice, effectively a gag order, preventing media from discussing details that might compromise national security. A few reports in the London Times followed, but the story was basically swept under the rug. Why? Well, the producers of the 2008 crime film, The Bank Job, claimed to have the answer. The titular heist was, in fact, set up by the British Security Service, better known as MI5, to steal back compromising photos of Princess Margaret, Queen Elizabeth II's wayward younger sister. The film suggests that Margaret, whose marriage was in deep decline and who was enjoying a lot of time on the Caribbean island of Mastega, had been captured in blurry images, participating in a threesome with a nameless man and woman. More recent chatter suggests that if the robbery was set up by MI5, then the pictures were of Margaret and a small-time gangster, John Benden, who had also spent time on the island. The royals and gangsters. Benden claimed in 1972 that he had engaged in an intimate relationship with the princess, and that he had photos to prove it. Now, why would the royal family associate with gangsters? Was the bank robbery done in service to the crown? Possibly. And the producers of the film claimed they got the inside scoop from those in the know. But of course they would say that. Even if it's not true, there's no denying that Princess Margaret was a frequent fixture in the British gossip pages, long before Prince Harry learned the hard way that what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. His great aunt was giving the palace serious palpitations. They compare Princess Margaret to Prince Harry, but I don't believe there's any comparison at all. Princess Margaret was loyal to the royal family and to Queen Elizabeth. Harry completely left the royal family. There's no comparison to it at all. Okay. Margaret was born in Scotland in 1930 during a late summer thunderstorm. If you're inclined to see these sorts of things as omens, then you could say she lived the rest of her life directly under a dark cloud. When Margaret was 6 years old, her Uncle David, known officially as Edward the Eighth, Edward the Eighth, I have a hard time with his Roman numerals, abdicated the throne over his refusal to give up Wallis Simpson, the twice divorced American temptress with Nazi sympathies. Margaret's father, Bertie, became King George VI, and her older sister, Princess Elizabeth, became heir apparent. Excuse me. And Margaret, she was heard wailing, "Now that Papa is king, I am nothing." Royal or not, the sisters fell into a pattern familiar to many parents. I tell you, they acted just like me and my sisters acted, okay? Elizabeth was 4 years older, was the serious and dutiful one. Margaret was the fun-loving, spoiled prankster, of whom little was expected. The sisters fought. Margaret was a biter. Elizabeth complained, "Margaret always wants what I want." Their childhood was as normal as could be expected. Margaret excelled at music, loved blood-soaked pirate comics, and was a natural comedian. In 1939, as the outbreak of war forced the royal family to decamp to Windsor Castle, Margaret whined, "Who is this Hitler spoiling everything?" Okay. While Elizabeth was groomed to be the next queen, Margaret was left to flounder. By the time she was 20 years old, her older sister was already married and had 2 children. Margaret's greatest talents seemed to be mastering the latest dance steps and being bright and funny. Her only purpose was to marry a rich aristocrat. While waiting for that eventuality, she threw herself into partying and clubbing, staying out until 4 a.m, smoking in public, and generally having a jolly good time. But the first man Margaret fell in love with was not a rich aristocrat. He was a dashing, middle-class fighter pilot named Peter Townsend, who had shot down the first German bomber on British soil. At age 29, he was considerably older than 13-year-old Margaret when he came into her father's service as a equerry, the guy who announces visitors to the king. And he was a married man. Margaret developed a terrific crush on him, one that would blossom into a full-blown infatuation a few years later. He accompanied her on her official duties, and she could often be found hanging around his office, a perk of his promotion to deputy master of the household. When she was 22, their affair began in earnest. Townsend's marriage was by then breaking up, and Margaret wasn't a child anymore. At first, it seems both the Queen Mother and Queen Elizabeth, who had ascended the throne on February 6, 1952, after the death of their father, were prepared to accept Townsend. But Margaret was not a private citizen, and marriage was not hers to decide, a fact that highlights one of the most bizarre aspects of modern royal life. According to the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, until she reached the age of 25, Margaret could not marry without the Queen's consent. Now, as I understand, until the age of 25 in Britain, you're still a youth and had to have the Queen or King's consent to marry. That's what I understand. At 25, you're considered an adult, and under 25, you're still a youth. Now, if that's right or not, I'm not sure, but that's what I understand. Okay. After that, her nuptials would have to be agreed upon by British Parliament as well as the parliaments of Commonwealth countries. The Queen couldn't help a sister out either, because the monarch is also head of the Church of England, and Townsend, a divorcee who was not acceptable to the church. The Queen would have to win agreement from the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who thought it would be a bad idea for Elizabeth to give her consent before her coronation set for June the 2nd, 1953. It's strange to think that having just survived World War II, the country would be so concerned over the marriage plans of a 22-year-old woman, regardless of her royal rank. From what I understand of royalty, you cannot marry a person who is not of that line. You have to marry within that line. Princess Diana was of that line. She was of the low line. And Kate Middleton, she was of the low line. Even though they called them commoners, they were of the low line. They were part of the royals, part of the royal low line. And Queen Elizabeth is the high line. Prince Charles, well, now King Charles, is of the high line. Camilla will never be queen. She can be a queen consort, but she can never be queen. Kate Middleton can be queen, and Princess Diana could have been queen. But Harry married a woman who was not of the high line or low line. So even if Harry was in direct line to be king, Meghan could never, ever be queen. Okay? That's how I understand. Okay. Okay, where was I? Oh, right here. But Britain had only just moved beyond the 1936 abdication crisis triggered by Wallis Simpson's divorce record. See, what happened was right here, King Edward could have remained king, but Wallis Simpson would have never, ever been accepted as queen. Okay. Now, despite efforts to keep the story under wraps, British tabloids had gotten wind of Margaret's romantic travails. According to the BBC, rumors began circulating after Margaret was seen brushing a piece of fluff from Townsend's jacket at Elizabeth's coronation. Bad press began to accumulate. As one newspaper sniffed, It is quite unthinkable that a royal princess, third in line of succession to the throne, should even contemplate a marriage with a man who has been through a divorce. The state moved to part the lovers, and in July 1953, Townsend was assigned to a position abroad. The couple wouldn't see each other again for a year. And so Margaret waited. When she finally reached her 25th birthday, she was cautiously confident that Parliament would at last give its seal of approval. But the politicians had other ideas, don't they all? The princess was told that a sizable fraction threatened to resign in protest if she married a divorced man. Marriage to Townsend was still possible, but only in a civil court, and that would mean giving up her rights of succession. Her duties and privileges as a princess, and crucially her income, she would, like her uncle before her, be forced to move abroad for an indeterminate time. That was too much to ask. On October 31st, 1955, the BBC interrupted its normal broadcast to read a statement from the princess, in which she told the nation she had decided not to marry Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage, but mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. Margaret had always been given everything she ever wanted, but she couldn't have love. If I had been allowed to marry Peter, I am sure we would have been happy, she later lamented. And who knows, it might have lasted. Sadly, her real marriage did not. The official royal family biographer of Margaret is a bare-bones affair, married to Anthony Armstrong Jones on May 6, 1960 at Westminster Abbey. 2 children, divorced in 1978. Just the facts, none of the juicy reality. Here's what really happened. After the Townsend affair, Margaret found herself with few matrimonial prospects. All the nice young men who had once been a part of her set had been taken by other women while she was waiting for permission to marry. Once again, she threw herself into wild living, visiting nightclubs and dancing the cha-cha, jitterbug, jive, and Charleston. After meeting the princess following one of his shows, Louis Armstrong pronounced her one hip chick. I tell you, Princess Margaret was cool. Margaret could sing well. If a bit husky after a decade of heavy smoking, and she liked a good drink. None of that made it difficult for her to perform her daytime duties, which included opening schools and cracking bottles of champagne on various things. If Margaret resented her sister, she showed it by not arriving to the Queen's 10th wedding anniversary celebration until after midnight and staying for less than an hour. Margaret met her future husband, Anthony Armstrong Jones, when he was working as a photographer at a party she attended, though she probably didn't remember the encounter afterward. When they crossed paths again, this time at a party he was invited to, Armstrong Jones was then an up-and-coming society photographer taking pictures of glossy mags like Tatler. The two soon became friends, with Margaret frequently frequenting his Pimlico studio apartment. Armstrong Jones, Tony, was not at all the sort of man Margaret usually hung out with. After he moved out of his studio, for example, he rented a room in a friend's house in London's Docklands, where he shared a toilet with the landlord. This was a far cry from the Scottish castles and ground country estates Margaret grew up with. Tony was the son of a successful lawyer, which was a plus. But his parents were divorced, which was not. He was so not Margaret's sort that one of her friends made him use the servants' entrance when he visited. He was also rumored to be gay, but he was fun and exciting. And, well, she had just found out that Peter Townsend was marrying again, so just like that, she agreed to marry him. This time her family didn't put up a fight. The couple wed with great pomp and extra circumstance at Westminster Abbey on May 6, 1960. Margaret's first child arrived a year later, just a few weeks after her husband was made Earl of Snowdon and Viscount Linley. Couldn't have the boy be born without a heredity title. Tony, meanwhile, continued to earn a living as a photographer and later a documentary film producer, convinced of the need to pay his own way. The marriage worked for a while. Tony and Margaret made friends with all kinds of swinging 60s types. Comedian Peter Sellers, writer Gore Vidal, designer Mary Quaint, the Aga Khan. They partied with booze. Her and Peel's him, and they had a lot of sex. Just not always with each other. Wow. Okay. The cracks in the marriage that had started to form in the 1960s were veritable chasms by decades in. The couple was staying together for the children and for the country. Divorce was still scandalous, after all. But both were having affairs. Tony with a 23-year-old and Margaret with men closer to her own age and social status. She also began spending more time on Mustig, the Hinduistic Caribbean island, where a friend had given her a plot of land as a wedding gift. By 1973, Margaret's friends felt that she needed a lover, so they set her up with Roddy Llewellyn, a vaguely aristocrat and sexually confused, sometimes punk rocker, 17 years her younger. Wow. The two met during a holiday at a friend's estate in Scotland. Before the week was over, they were in love. Their meeting was apparently fated. Roddy had visited a fortune teller 5 years earlier who said he'd meet someone whose name began with M and whom he had spent a lot of time in the West Indies. At the beginning of the relationship, Roddy had help from Margaret's friends who groomed him to be her lover. Wow. After a year, however, he chafed at the strictures of being involved with a married princess. Tony wasn't above being jealous, and he took off, first to Sweeney, too close, and then to Turkey, without telling anyone. Margaret was reportedly so distressed that she swallowed a handful of sleeping pills. Upon his return, the lovers decided to take a breather. So he goes away, and then he returns, and then they take a breather. Okay, whatever. Roddy's behavior grew increasingly unhinged. After a bender in Barbados and a breakdown on the plane ride back home, he was checked into a mental facility to rest. Meanwhile, Tony had fallen in love with his assistant, a woman whom Margaret called that thing. He was also drinking heavily and barely disguising his hostility for his wayward wife. She said later they would practically growl at each other when passing on the stairs. In 1976, after she and a recuperated Roddy had resumed their relationship, the two were photographed eating lunch together at a bar in Muskegon. Tony used the blurry picture as leverage to finally obtain a separation. Margaret and Roddy's relationship continued throughout her separation, despite the disapproval of her sister and brother-in-law. Roddy, who by then completed a horticulture course and found his calling as a gardener, was brought out for events in the hope that the public might come to accept him. But then he had to go out and cut a record and invest in a restaurant and generally make a fool of himself. Basically, whatever Roddy did, it would invariably lead to bad press, with Margaret making a twerp of herself over him. When Roddy eventually left for a woman his own age, Margaret found herself alone yet again. She faced the situation with a stiff upper lip sort of realism. I don't see myself ever marrying again. As a member of the royal family, one is used as a figurehead, and being the sister of you-know-who, it would put her in a difficult position. Anyway, it would probably be too much of a bore. Okay. Margaret never did remarry, and her middle age was marked by poor health. Drinking became her main vice, even after she received a diagnosis of alcoholic hepatitis in the late 1970s. In 1985, she had part of her lung removed, but according to the BBC, continued to smoke. She suffered a stroke in 1994 and another in 2000, followed by a mini stroke. She lost vision in one eye and was confined to a wheelchair. She died on February 9, 2002, at the age of 71. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Margaret remained a favorite target for the British press. Private Eye always called her the Royal Dwarf, owing to her tiny stature. Even as a bedridden Margaret neared the end of her life, one tabloid declared, "She's spoilt and ill-mannered, and over the years has drunk enough whiskey to open a distillery." As unfair and nasty as the press could be, Margaret didn't do much to dispel the public's negative perception of her. One does feel rather sorry for her, but she does so very little to help herself, wrote a palace insider. She was spoiled even in middle age. A friend wrote of her in his diary, "She is, as we all know, tiresome, spoiled, idle, and irritating. She has no direction, no overriding interest. Hapless and aimless, she did indeed drink her way through life. She could also be grumpy and ill-tempered, prone to pouts, sulking, and occasional bouts of rudeness, none of which plays well to the public. But Margaret could also be surprisingly kind. She could be counted on to remember birthdays and to send gifts. Her softer side made striking appearances, such as on a diplomatic trip to the tiny Polynesian island of Tuvalu. When her lady-in-waiting was practically eaten alive by insects, the princess gave her own bed to the unfortunate woman and tended the bites herself. She was also full of weird household tips, like how to make perfect scrambled eggs, add a raw egg at the final moment of cooking, and she wanted people around her to relax and be normal. And though Margaret may have been frivolous, and boozy, she took her official duties very seriously. So much so that she capitulated to the will of the nation, didn't marry the man she wanted, and then stayed married to another whom she should have divorced years earlier. Princess Margaret's life was certainly bizarre. She was never given anything to do, and so suffered the sparer's fate of being purely ornamental. That left her more than enough latitude to get up to trouble, a situation compounded by being constantly hounded by paparazzi, a new breed of journalists more rabid and unambiguously than their ancestors. Everything she did was in the spotlight in a way that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of royals, and it made her a focal point for those in politics who wanted to curtail the monarchy and its income. They couldn't attack the queen, on whose head the crown seemed to sit, as easily as those pillbox hats she wore, but they could attack her scandalous sister. Margaret's life was recorded by a flock of unauthorized biographies, including H.R.H. The Princess Margaret, A Life Unfulfilled, and Margaret, the Tragic Princess. Even if the pages of such books are filled with speculation and gossip, they at least got the titles right. Yeah, it's a sad life. I agree, that was a sad life. But that's what one does if you're in royalty. If you're royal, then you're supposed to act royal, I think. I mean, you're born into it. It's a sad situation, but you're born into it, and you got to deal with it. Hope y'all enjoyed. Next time I see you will be on the beach. So stay tuned for that. Have a great week, y'all.